Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the last panel of the conference. Before I start, I want to say thank you to Sukti, to Brian, Meg, Nialafar for organizing. It's been a terrific conference, and to all of the participants and the audience for your meaningful contributions. My name is Deborah Popowski. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice, the other human rights institute here at NYU School of Law. I am also a human rights lawyer and scholar by training. And the center, after being the lone human rights center at NYU for 15 years, has really welcomes the arrival of the Bernstein Institute with open arms. And we are delighted to have a new partner in our project to expand the human rights community at the law school and at NYU. And we're particularly grateful to participate in this panel as the center prepares to harness its resources over the coming years to focus on the increased crackdown that we're facing in the United States from government as well as corporate and other non-governmental actors, and looking at what this means for human rights defenders in the US and for international human rights institutions more broadly. And at the center, which has a research-based mission, among other things, this means asking the question of what happens to the Human Rights Project in an era of rising nationalism, explicit xenophobic and racist policies, open kleptocracy, and what are fairly clear and loud promises to dismantle or weaken human rights institutions. So with that bleak question in mind, I have the pleasure of moderating this last panel, a group of terrific panelists. As with the other introductions, we will keep the intros brief as you have people's full bios in your programs. To my left, we have Bahar Azmi, the legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Then Sarah Kendzior, journalist and a doctor in anthropology, specializing in authoritarian politics, a journalist who has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, the Globe and Mail, and many other publications. Tor Hadenfield, policy and research officer for Civicus, an international alliance dedicated to strengthening citizen action in civil society, and Biraj Patnaik, South Asia director of Amnesty International, and also convener of civil society organization Support Cell in India, making a second appearance. That's how much we value his insight. So today's panel is a little bit different from the earlier ones in that it gives us an opportunity to take some space to collect the wisdom and experience that we've heard of people gathered over the last 2 days, and to reflect on what we can learn from them in our own struggle to resist here in the United States. I won't try and recap everything that's happened in those 2 days, but very briefly, we've talked about and heard about a wide range of ways in which governments engage in oppression, whether that be through violence, physical restrictions, criminalization of dissent, through detentions, political prosecutions, even disappearances and killings, to surveillance, to restrictions on registration, association, funding, online expression and independent media, the deployment of terrorism and extremism labels to discredit human rights defenders and their work. We've also heard about the equally wide range of ways in which civil society engages in resistance, some of them legal and many of them extra-legal, whether that be through technology, performance art, public advocacy, media, business, community organizing, and community empowerment. We've talked about how corporate actors can engage in both oppression and resistance, and we've also talked a lot about the ways in which all of these categories are not monolithic. There are a range of actors within government and civil society, and it's important for us as we engage in these projects to map out the ways that they all work together to push down and push back. I also want to make a point that several panelists have made, and I think it's important to emphasize here that although we are seeing clear, troubling, and downward trends in all of these places, including our own country, that for many of our own communities or the communities we work with, this isn't so much a new phenomenon, so much as one that's become more visible. Fault line, so to speak, that's become more exposed, perhaps because a wider range of people are becoming affected rather than those who are only at the margins. Or because the types of restrictions are becoming more intense or at least more overt and visible. So we will hear from each panelist. We'll have about 8 minutes for some opening remarks, and generally, they're not going to touch on everything, but the general ask is that they speak on their perspective, for those of you who are based in the United States, your perspective on challenges faced here, strategies that have been deployed to respond, lessons you've taken away and, from human rights defenders in other communities and countries, and how you've adapted them, and also really questions, right? This is a space to also recognize all the things that we don't know, and we really do want to make space for a conversation. And for those of you who are based abroad or for whom much of your work is done outside the United States, what parallels and differences do you see? What advice do you have for us? And what are some areas for collaboration? So after each panelist speaks for 8 minutes, we will have about 25 minutes of moderated question and answer here, and then we will open it up to the floor for an open discussion for another 25 minutes. Thanks. So Bahar, can we start with you?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Deborah. So, I'm the legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is a now 50-year-old legal and educational political organization that uses litigation in partnership with political and social movements to advance progressive social causes. And I think, as I understood, part of the question to me as a sort of, domestic human rights and civil rights NGO, how has our strategic thinking changed since Trump came into office? And in the spirit of surfacing more questions than answers, because I think there's so much uncertainty, want to sort of tell a story about our strategic planning process. Like a lot of NGOs, we tried to develop a strategic plan and it became nearly final in October, which baked in a whole set of assumptions about what the world would look like in the next 4 to 8 years. And at first blush, we wondered if this kind of thinking was sort of beside the point in light of the new threats. But I think there's a way in which it actually is maybe sort of more resilient and more relevant now. So we wanted to think about attacking not any particularly, sort of issue areas in the way that sort of a law school might break up cases or courses around particular, social justice issues, but kind of think radically about the ways in which there are certain systems or structures that repress vulnerable communities in this country, and in a sort of persistent long-term way, and asked, to what extent we should be trying to develop legal and political strategies to dismantle those systems. And the 4 we identified were state power, particularly around the development of this vast national security vocabulary and legal apparatus, from Guantanamo, drone strikes, torture, impunity from accountability for violation of human rights norms, and broad-based militarism that has an international, externally facing dimension, but also has seeped into the domestic politics as well, in terms of persecution of Muslims and militarization of police forces, et cetera. A second system is structural racism, including anti-Muslim racism. Third is structural gender oppression, and including patriarchy, heteronormative patriarchy. And a fourth is economic repression. And so there's at some level, it seemed sort of impractical to be talking about these kind of systemic harms in our politics, given the kind of direct, concrete threats, and maybe it is, but there's a way in which it actually opens up a conversation, because I think it might have been harder to talk about state power and militarism in an Obama-Clinton axis, when, in fact, in the past we've had very little traction being able to criticize Obama for Guantanamo or drone strikes or militarism. But now, given the sort of incoherent and very dangerous foreign policy and the sort of unmasking of military strength to get domestic political support, I think there may be a stronger conversation, a more sort of open conversation about the dangers of militarism, both in sort of seemingly kind administrations, because it lends legal sanction or permission to subsequent crazy administrations. I mean, conversation about structural racism is certainly, and we sort of framed conversations about race in this country traditionally around kind of racial discrimination rather than overt racism. And that was a sort of harder space for us to talk about in an Obama-Clinton domain, but now can one, given the sort of dynamics in the election and the full embrace of white supremacy in the White House and the Attorney General's office, isn't this now, you know, a real opportunity to build coalitions and conversations about institutional racism, historic racism, you know, white supremacy and resentment, finally sort of, not finally, but really more overtly seizing power and translating that to repression. Gender oppression, I mean, the sort of sort of obvious ways in which reproductive rights are being curtailed even at the federal level, defunding Planned Parenthood, an agenda where religious conservatism has such a massive platform in the White House, and their narratives around religious freedom to repress LGBT communities and women very kind of overtly. I think that's an open conversation. It's not a silent and a war. And of course, economic repression. I mean, what an unbelievable story, the way in which this has played out, the sort of faux economic populism that's just fed, you know, Wall Street and massive industrial power structures, and that will screw the poor over again. And that, of course, is braided with structural racism, as it often is historically. So maybe that's, you know, and I'm not sure, you know, I don't know what sort of legal strategies necessarily this translates into, but it does seem like there's an open space for conversation. And in a way, there are some additional kind of strategic obstacles that I think we've identified that we have to sort of take into account in pushing back against these structural forces. One is obviously the absence of a kind of mainstream White House presence. So anti-racism work or police accountability work looks very different in a place without Vanita Gupta running the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, or without some political conversation with the Obama administration about closing Guantanamo. And so that sort of middle space in terms of like sort of basic elementary pursuit of equality and social justice has now been, that had permitted some groups to sort of push on the margins, is now vacated, and it's not clear you know, how to fill up that mainstream space with civil society. I think it's doable, and it seems to be, there seems to be a responsiveness in that direction. But that's one obvious challenge. Another obvious challenge is the weakness of international institutions. Obviously, the America First rhetoric suggests the rejection, a sort of robust, embraced rejection of international law norms, even security international law norms, like at least as of till yesterday, NATO. It shows how little traction. I'm worried that sort of international conversations, international norms, international institutions, which are, I think, vulnerable politically, can have in this administration, even as compared to the Bush administration, when international human rights norms were marshaled, both around with mixed success, but at least it had salience and relevancy in the conversations in limiting some of the worst abuses. And so what does that mean when you have this sort of rampant militarism, for example? And then the final challenge, which I've said may also be an opportunity. I mean, it's a challenge to the threat to actual communities is racism, Islamophobia that have, and xenophobia, and the ways in which those policies can be so dangerously operationalized in the White House. And I think we'll get into some details later. We largely think the legal strategy needs to be the same, which is, for us anyway, using law in support of what seemed to be increasingly activated social and political movements who are engaged and want to challenge these manifestations of the Trump era. And I can talk a little bit more about what that looks like specifically later.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kenzier. As was mentioned before, I started out my career studying authoritarian states in Central Asia. And among the people who I studied were the leaders of these states. People like Islam Karimov of Uzbekistan, a strongman who relied on media manipulation and spectacle in order to sway the masses, who did a kleptocratic shakedown of his country along with his fashion designer daughter, who seemed to have political ambitions of her own, who scapegoated Muslims in order to hide human rights abuses and to try to have a pretext for their justification. I also studied leaders like Sapar Murad Niyazov, otherwise known as Turkmenbashi, a megalomaniacal, brutal leader who built a golden statue of himself that rotated to face the sun, and went around, naming everything about himself, as do other leaders in Central Asia, constantly putting their names on buildings. I don't know who this reminds you of. Anyway, my point is, when Trump started to gain popularity, I was deeply alarmed for many reasons, one of which is that I saw that it was possible. I also live in St. Louis. I live, not in Trump country, but close to it, and I live in a bottomed out part of America that had been suffering, and that, Trump's whole career has been based on, shaking down vulnerable people in vulnerable situations and coming in. So, I thought he would win, and now he did, and now we have to live with the consequences. Trump and his policies are not actually hard to predict. They're hard for people to believe, and they're hard for people to accept, because if you do, then you have to consider the ramifications of his words and actions, and the suffering that this administration causes, and the frailty of our institutions, which has allowed this to happen. Americans are known for optimism, but blind optimism is only blindness. You can't confront a problem unless you actually acknowledge that it exists. In this political climate, I think you need a dark imagination to see the light. And I think that people in this room are better equipped than most. Now, I know everyone was talking before about how, we're not supposed to leave here depressed, and I'm sorry, but you really, picked the wrong person if that was your goal. But, I actually think that, confronting the reality of the Trump administration, however grim that is the key to possibly turning this around, or at least mitigating the worst of the damages. So, on that note, I'll make two brief points, which I think you already know, but in case you don't, because they keep coming up in the news. One is the alleged pivot that we've been waiting for 2 years. Trump is never going to pivot. What he wants to do and has been doing and has somewhat successfully done is pivoted the United States towards him and his extreme positions, so that things that were once on the fringes are now our mainstream rhetoric, and things that once shocked people are things that we just sort of, many people shrug or roll their eyes or just, don't know what to make of. That gets into you and can eat away with you over time. But that pivot's not coming. This kind of goes hand in hand with the Trump is going to become presidential narrative, which happens whenever Trump does something remarkable, like read off a teleprompter and therefore dispute the rumor that he doesn't know how to read, and say something that's not outrageously racist but mildly racist, or drop a giant bomb in Syria and Afghanistan and then be praised for it by cable news. That's dangerous. That's not presidential. There's no strategy behind this. Where there is a strategy, though, is in members of the administration who are using Trump and exploiting the vulnerability and chaos of the situation for their own means. And so I thought what I'd do today is, kind of try to break down some of the key players of this for those of you who don't spend every day gripped to Sean Spicer's amazing press conferences and, need a little blow-by-blow of just how many terrible people we've allowed into the American government. To be clear, I don't think that, we are an authoritarian state. If we were an authoritarian state, I obviously wouldn't be sitting here telling you about it. I do think that we have a government with authoritarian ambitions, with autocratic ambitions, with kleptocratic ambitions, And they're held back only by what's left of our checks and balances, especially the judiciary, and by citizen protests and demands for accountability. So now I'll try to be brief. I'll give you a little breakdown of the different players that are within this administration and what they want. And true to our great leader, Cittadini, I'm going to divide this into haters and losers. And I'm going to begin with the haters. And so, well, Trump actually is both. Trump is a hater and a loser, or he wouldn't be manipulated so easily. Trump's goal is basically a kleptocracy, and in this case, I think a dynastic kleptocracy. You know, in every venture that he's gone through, whether real estate or higher education, you know, he has taken a vulnerable and, you know, a population in pain and shaken it down for his personal wealth. And I think that that's what he, you know, he views the government. He doesn't have a coherent ideology. He has some, you know, core beliefs, but they're easily manipulated. He's both sadistic and erratic, which is a terrible combination, but makes him useful for a number of people. I think one thing we need to be very wary of with Trump is nepotism and the role of Ivanka and Jared in this administration. I think, you know, you see this in autocracies all over the world, this, you know, hiring under no merit of relatives of the president into positions of power, into positions where they have clearance and access that they shouldn't really get. I think, you know, Trump's other goal is to escape prosecution for what seem to be serious crimes. And one way to kind of equip yourself for that fate is to make sure that money stays in the family. Like a typical autocrat, you know, he's paranoid, he trusts his kin, and he also trusts them with his finances and with whatever he can kind of reap by abusing executive power. So I think that Ivanka and Jared are people we need to keep our eye on. Jared's alleged rival is Steve Bannon, who I'll discuss next. Personally, I think this is fabricated. I don't think that they're actually fighting. I think that, you know, there's currently a narrative that Bannon and Jared Kushner are in a feud. I think this is to make Kushner seem more appealing because Steve Bannon's like the least appealing person who we've probably ever had in a national advisor position. You know, he's part of this wing of the Trump administration that's overtly white supremacist, overtly extremist, and has been, you know, part of this mainstreaming of political culture. With Bannon, I think, you know, there's rumors that he's going to be put out of the White House. Again, I stress you to look at what that actually means. Is he no longer going to be a public face of the administration, or is he actually going to be removed? So the things to kind of look for him, oh boy, 2 minutes, and I've got so many more jerks to go, are, you know, access, clearance, stuff like that. All right, real brief, Pence kind of represents this theocratic, extreme conservative wing. We've got all the guys who are currently being investigated by the FBI, Manafort, Flintstone, Page, otherwise known as volunteers. That's a whole nother story, but that sort of shows the, again, kind of kleptocratic ambitions. We have Jeff Sessions in terms of the crowd gathered here that know about law. I think Sessions is one of the most dangerous people in the administration. I think he is a clear indicator that whatever authoritarian tendencies the United States is currently expressing are not something that we've borrowed from abroad, but things that have always been here. And he's going to try to repeal things like voting rights, civil rights. So for everybody who's talking about 2018, we need to be looking at what Jeff Sessions is doing right now, or there's not going to be a 2018 in which all people are freely able to vote. Very briefly, the losers, since they need a shout out, Carson, DeVos, Rick Perry, Sean Spicer of the Holocaust Centers. These are people who were, you know, put into their positions and basically to destroy the departments that they lead, you know, who are so incompetent that they're in the direct opposition with the goals of what they should be doing. That's on purpose. That is to weaken the United States as a country, and that's something that both Trump and Bannon have expressed. And the last sort of group are the GOP, who I think are kind of looking at this situation like, what the hell just happened, but how can I personally benefit from it, and what can I get out of it before this guy actually drops a nuke on North Korea or vice versa. And so, you know, they're opportunists. I don't think that they are acting in our best interest. And, you know, I'll conclude by saying, you know, unfortunately, I think we need to be prepared for the worst, particularly regarding the North Korean situation I just mentioned. You can't see a mushroom cloud coming through rose-colored glasses. And on that note, I'll conclude. Thank you.
So I've never been accused of being an optimist in my entire life. That might change I think. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Deborah, and thank you, the Bernstein Institute, for organizing this important meeting. It really is an honor to be among so many comrades and activists this week. I'm going to ask an indulgence at the beginning of this presentation. I'm going to, in a moment, try to contextualize what's happening in the United States within the global landscape of civil society. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you four straightforward questions, and ask yourself. The first is, can I criticize my head of state on Twitter? The second is, can I join a human rights group to campaign for change? The third is, can I take part in a peaceful protest outside my government building? And fourth, and most importantly, can I do all of these things while knowing that my government will not just protect me, but actually enable my right to organize, speak out, and take action on issues that matter to me and are critical of the state? If you can say yes to all four of these questions, congratulations. You are part of a tiny, tiny minority in the world. Only 26 countries in the world can people say with confidence that they live in a country with an open civic space. Last week, the organization that I work with, called Civicus, released a new project called the Civicus Monitor. And the Civicus Monitor is tasked with developing a global depiction of civil society landscape across the world in real time. So we assess every country in the world, look at their rights to freedom of assembly, rights to freedom of association, rights to freedom of expression, and the ability of activists to operate. And we now have covered 193 countries in Kosovo and Palestine. And what we found, that only 3% of the world's population live in countries where you can exercise those rights without fear of persecution, and in an environment in which you're confident your government will support you to exercise that right. They won't, not that they'll crack down on it, but they'll actively help fulfill that right with you. We've also noted that in 106 countries across the world, these rights are being seriously violated. That the space is closed or extremely repressed. That 3.2 billion people in the world, many of whom live in America, live in countries where they cannot exercise their rights without an immense fear of persecution. And Civicus has been looking at this issue for 20 years. We've been looking at civic space across the world, whether it's in Ethiopia, as discussed this week, or Kenya, or Uzbekistan. But what we're seeing is that this democratic backsliding or deconsolidation is not just afflicting emerging states or emerging democracies or autocratic regimes, but they're afflicting consolidated, robust democracies across the world. We're seeing that these tendencies of repression of civic space are afflicting places like the United Kingdom, like Australia, France, and the United States. The United States, according to the Monitor, is thought of as narrowed, which means that people are largely allowed to exercise their rights, but are subject to unwarranted restrictions. We've also put the United States on something called the Civicus Monitor Watch List, where 5 countries that we've identified have had a precipitous decline in respect for civic space in the country. So the United States is coupled with Myanmar, Egypt, Turkey, and so we're closely watching the situation. If we step out of the American context, we can remove ourselves from our American-centric perspective and look objectively at what's happening in America, we'll see a few key trends that afflict countries across the world, that afflict Honduras, Ecuador, Brazil. Just look at it objectively. In the past 2 months, state legislators have proposed or adopted 19 laws attempting to restrict freedom of assembly, imposing unwarranted and undue restrictions on the right to protest in 19 states. 6 journalists were arrested and charged with felony rioting during the inauguration ceremonies. The police are infiltrating our protest movements, specifically Black Lives Matter, in a systematic way. And what's important, I think, what we've discussed this week is that these challenges are not just happening in the United States, that there is solidarity across the world. And this is not a new phenomenon. It might be relatively new to the United States. Some might disagree about the Bush era or the Nixon era. But there are lessons to be learned from our comrades and colleagues across the world for 50, 20 years in Uzbekistan, have been facing extreme repression. And we have a lot to learn from them. This Eurocentric model, an American-centric model, that we know that only fit for purpose is our architecture, needs to be rethought, that we have things to learn from other countries and other movements across the world. And very briefly, how many minutes do I have, Deborah? 2 minutes. Great. Very briefly, give an example. Leave on a positive note. Sarah. I'm not an optimist.
You are by default.
South Korea. In 2014, 300 people were killed in a ferry accident in South Korea. The vast majority of the people who died in this accident outside Seoul were children, students taking a trip on the ferry. The government did not, according to the vast majority of the people, did not adequately investigate this crime. They weren't transparent in their investigation. There was no accountability. A year later, about 800 NGOs came together, including trade unions, including watchdog groups, legal advocacy groups. 800 organizations came together and developed a campaign and a movement, a sustained movement, calling a very discrete issue, very discrete, about one specific incident, calling for accountability for what happened in January 2014 when 300 people were killed. And during that movement, hundreds of activists were detained. The security forces used excessive force, including tear gas, rubber bullets. And then, directly following the protest movements, the police targeted the leaders of the movement. So leaders of the movement were sentenced to 5 years, whether, involved in the union side or the NGO side. 5 years, 10 years. 500 activists were summarily arrested the day after the protest, summoned for questioning, 20 of whom were given a year sentence. And South Korea as a government has a similar architecture to the United States. It is also assessed as narrowed by Civicus in the Monitor. But that movement on a very, very discrete issue, which we have several which in the United States, grew into a national protest movement. Starting 5 months ago, the same groups who were involved in that movement started calling for the impeachment of President Park in South Korea. For 5 months, every Saturday, tens of thousands of people joined together in protest. Every Saturday for 5 months. On March 10th, last week, the Constitutional Court upheld the impeachment of President Park, who was accused of a number of illicit activities similar to what we see in America. So we see this nexus between a sustained protest movement. We see that people will go to jail, people will be persecuted. But that movement does impact the larger legal architecture. As a result of that movement, the Constitutional Court, as I said, upheld the decision to impeach the president. So there are positive examples within the global context to be learned from America. I'm not advocating the impeachment of, well, I am, of President Trump, wholeheartedly. But there are lessons to be learned from our comrades and colleagues, and I hope you'll be able to recognize that this week. And I've learned a tremendous amount, so thank you so much.
Yep. Hi, my name is Biraj Patnaik, and I work with Amnesty now, but I've also been involved with the civil society organizing in India around pressures of state regulation. And I want to say right away that we were asked as panelists to share what the US can learn from our experience. And let me say it up front that a big shout out to all of you, because the manner in which the United States of America has resisted this administration is unprecedented. It's absolutely unprecedented. And I think there are lots of lessons the other way around, which we can learn. The millions of people who came out on the streets to protest, the takedown of this administration's lies, one tweet at a time, the amount of mobilization that's happening around social media. I mean, this is really unprecedented, and this is something that you should be proud of. Because in most contexts across the world, you don't have an incoming president, within weeks of his taking office, or within days actually of his taking office, finding the kind of resistance that Trump did in the United States of America. So I think that's something that all of us can learn from. Now, in terms of what are the lessons and challenges that we are facing in India, I mean, one question that one is always asked with is that, is Trump comparable to Prime Minister Modi, for instance? And this is a question that is very common. Every Indian asks, you know, what is the comparison? And I say in jest, with a bit earnest as well, but that Modi is Trump with work experience. But it's actually not true. Because, you know, unlike President Trump, Prime Minister Modi, he has an ideology that will complete 100 years in a few years' time. Deep-rooted political ideology of a Hindu nationalist state, ideology that led to the killing of Mahatma Gandhi, and so on. So he does have an ideology. Second, he does have a political party, and amongst the biggest political parties in the world, not in the sense that the Trump has the Republican Party, but in a real way that leaders carry political parties. He's not an outsider. Third, he also has a political cadre, grassroots cadre, independent of the political party, which belong to this ideology of hatred and Hindu nationalism, which is again the largest civil society movement in the world with more than 6 million voluntary members. Fourth, he has administrative experience within government, having been in power for decades now. And lastly, he understands societal fault lines in a way that I don't think Trump does. Even though it appears that Trump is able to exploit a societal fault line, it's a one-trick pony. It's just one major fault line that you're exploiting, whereas Modi has demonstrated the ability to exploit not just religion, not just caste, but increasingly class as well as a societal fault line in a deeply divided and discriminated society to gather a constituency which is unprecedented. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say, and he's a great communicator, he's a terrific communicator, he's the greatest communicator in the world, as Trump would say. And he is a great communicator. He has, and what is common with Trump is the simplicity of his message. You know, it's always that one line that covers a lot of ground, which appeals to his audience in a way that any messaging that we do just doesn't seem to do. I mean, here is a man who demonetized, which is knocked off 86% of the country's currency in one go. 150, it's basically taking away 86% of your money and saying that it's not valid from midnight today. And what happens? He wins the next election with a 2/3 majority in the largest state in the world, the fourth largest election in the world actually, which is the state of Uttar Pradesh, close to 220 million voters, 2/3 majority. After a measure which is demonetized 86% of the country's economy, 150 people died just standing in the queues, bank queues, trying to get their money out in the 3-month period. Entire country thrown into economic disarray, informal sector. 96% of the country's economy is in the informal sector, largely dependent on cash. Barely 4 to 5% of the country is in the formal sector employment. And yet, you had this election victory. So this ability to exploit a societal fault line, to drive a change which is under any administration, under any circumstance, should have been deeply unpopular, but is still popular, I believe makes somebody like Mr. Modi a much harder political opponent than Donald Trump is. And therefore, the battle with a Modi or a Erdogan or a Duterte in Philippines is, in a sense, much harder because these leaders make fewer mistakes of the obvious kind because they have the administrative experience, they have an entire party machine backing them, and they have people, and they know exactly which levers of power to have complete control over beyond just their family and so on. Now, in terms of the mobilization, I can talk about the challenges that we face. The first big challenge is that every symbol of the nation or the citizen is being appropriated by the right wing today. So if it's a national flag, it's appropriated. If it's a national anthem, it's appropriated. And appropriated in a very cynical way, sometimes through judicial pronouncements, sometimes through state action, but appropriated in the sense that every time, as Matthew said yesterday, we now, in every cinema hall in the country, before every film is played, the national anthem will be played and everybody has to stand up. And of course, our Supreme Court made a concession by saying, well, if you're disabled, you can continue sitting down. But do please say it beforehand so that you don't get lynched by the audience. And this is literally happening across the country. So how do you reappropriate these symbols? And I think one symbol that we can successfully reappropriate still in India is the Constitution, and we haven't used that enough. Second is organizing in different ways. Because what 30 years of neoliberalism has done is it's broken the back of the trade unions. So, and trade unions always had the workers' movement always had a larger than disproportionate size of the protest space, in a sense, organized protest space. What you're dealing with now, in the absence of that, is a mob, which does not have an ideology, which does not have demands or the ability to articulate demands, or does not have the vision to take forward to a logical conclusion the demands they make. So how do you deal with the mob? Again, populism is not about the installation of right-wing governments, as I said yesterday. It's a process. And it's a process successfully engaged from people across the political spectrum. So there are things that Trump does which were common to the Corbyn campaign and to the Bernie Sanders campaign and to the Kejriwal campaign, which was a way of engaging with people that mainstream politics couldn't. And I think there's a lot for us to learn from that in terms of why is it that this engagement is succeeding, and what is it that the lessons that there could be for us. The next point I'd like to say is that in our traditional civil society work in India, we had the luxury of taking democracy and rule of law and a lot of these things as a given. And because you had the luxury of that, you could do your constituency building around thematic issues. So I worked, for instance, on mobilizing people on the right to food for many years. And somebody worked on health, somebody worked on education. That system is not working anymore. Because what you're dealing with on the other side is a message that is so overarching that constituency building that is limited only to single thematic issues or areas of work is unlikely to be able to present a coherent challenge to the wave of demonization and populism that's coming. So there's a much greater need for intersectional work and constituencies coming together. Last, I think in terms of the lessons in India, what's happening now is there's a lot of alternative media that's coming up. Philanthropists are backing alternative media. The mainstream media somehow seems either to be completely co-opted or not able to, unlike in the US. Again, I would like to draw an exception here. You have the New York Times, you have the Washington Post. These are not alternative papers. These are mainstream papers who have countered Trump from day one. But in countries like India, the entire mainstream media has bought into the narrative of populism for various reasons, largely because earlier the media used to be corporate controlled. Now the corporation is the media, in India at least. It is the corporate that is the media, with deep financial stakes which government can influence at any point in time, which is why there is a co-option which is unprecedented. So one of the responses to that has been the opening up of the internet space with alternative media that even philanthropists are supporting. There are plenty of ventures coming up now solely devoted to debunking the mistruths of the administration. Fact-based journalism, like India's Pen, for instance, is one which tries to nail every untruth that's put out by the government, every speech of the Prime Minister, line by line. I think that's something that we've learned from the US as well, successfully, because that's something that was done in the US through the campaign. So these are some of the broad challenges or lessons rather, that we can learn from each other. As I said in the beginning, I'm not in a position really to say that we've done this greatly, very successfully, and here's what the US can learn, because actually the resistance that you've put up, despite all the lack of optimism in the room, given what you're facing with, has been spectacular. I think the problem that all of us are facing is that we are used to speaking truth to power, and now we have to speak post-truth to post-power. and we don't know what that means. So, so good luck to all of us for that. Thank you.
So thank you all for that. I'm going to open up a question for all of you, and that's, throughout the days we've heard a lot about, in these moments of crisis, sometimes the importance or the need to take a more incrementalist approach, or the idea you do crisis management, you're trying to mitigate harm. And that's a reality, because we have people whose bodies are on the line. You have to get people out of jail. Somebody in one of the panels yesterday, we talked about a law in Uganda that restricts assembly and association in so many ways. Among them was the use of lethal force, and how the strategy in the end was to the strategy was to remove that piece of it, but the rest of the law remained. And as somebody who's been working in the U.S. on more structural change and CCRs and on that side too, what are the strategies for both having to deal with that stopping from backsliding and the management, crisis management, and the mitigation, while also, not falling prey to the danger of normalization and not challenging the structural problems? And so, Bahar, you introduced the idea of how CCR has a new strategic plan and is addressing that. I'd be curious to hear more about what that looks like in practice. And then from all of the panelists, if you have thoughts from your experience or advice on how you, either individually as an organization, or how you work in collaboration and coalition with other groups in order to ensure that you're both, dealing with harm mitigation, but also challenging the underarching structures that are causing the harm.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's I think I'm ambivalent, because I do see, as I said before, the ways in which the Trump administration has exposed these systemic forces in the way that have been masked by a kind of kind-looking chief executive and a sort of veneer of progressive action and policies in America. And so having these things laid bare does create opportunities. At the same time, I do think that in terms of where we can deploy resources strategically, there are so many communities that are directly under attack and need legal resources to protect them from harm. And I think one has to be mindful of both strategies. And could I just react to a couple of things everyone else said? This is such a really interesting conversation. Both in terms of where the threats are and what potential responses might be. I sort of stumbled on this phrase, but I think there's a lot to it. I'm trying to develop it more. This notion of living through our 11/9 moment. You just think about that a little bit, because for a very long time, in this country, there was a narrative about having woken up on 9/11 and everything having changed, and an analysis about how there was a genuine existential threat as a result of the attacks on 9/11 and the development of a series of dangerous, in my mind, practices to respond to that. And I think for a lot of civil libertarian, civil rights groups, those threats were exaggerated. It was not, in fact, existential. And I think the sort of 11/9 threat from the interior to is more dangerous, more systemic, more permanent. And the really, I think, great example of that is Sessions. I mean, I think, so 9/11, there's the, iconography of terror that was developed to sort of scare us into sacrificing civil liberties and developing a robust law enforcement response. That sort of external threat. Seems to me in our 11/9 moment, the iconography is around whatever the opposite of white supremacy is. So sort of black liberation and crime and black power, women's equality, LGBT rights. And I'd really sort of underscore Sarah's point that the great threat domestically seems to me, Jeff Sessions. And the other point is we can learn from international examples, but I think Sarah mentioned this, we can learn from domestic examples as well, i.e. segregationism and the Confederacy. And, I remember someone who's not a lawyer was like, is Sessions really that much worse than Ashcroft? And I was like, dude, Ashcroft's from a border state. Missouri. Sessions is full-on Confederacy. I think he is eager to deploy the same kinds of power structures to subvert democratic institutions and claims for equality in the United States through his language around carnage, and in terms of civil society, his alliance with the police in that segregationist way is really amazing. One, exaggerate the threat. Two, ask whose side are you on? He's clearly with the police, even though we have sort of record levels, low levels of crime. There is carnage everywhere. And are you with Black Lives Matter, or are you with the police? And he's adopted the fraternal order of police as talking points. And then forcing sort of repression of dissent for those who are not with the police. And so I think the good news is, as compared to the sort of 9/11 moment, 11/9 moment, is this. After 9/11, it seemed like there was very little civil society mobilization. So in response to the national security emergencies, there are a couple of people waving around a writ of habeas corpus. Now, there is a full kind of ecosystem of human rights, civil society groups who are well coordinated, well resourced, who meet in funder sort of spaces to coordinate strategies to challenge, dangerous national security practices. In the immigration space in 2001, the immigrants' rights space, I think that was also largely occupied by a few national impact litigation organizations challenging, federal laws that made it harder to access, the courts. And since the conversations around immigration policy started in the Bush administration, there is a vast array of grassroots immigrants' rights organizations that are regional, that are national, that are mobilized, that are connected, and that are working together. And even in the MASA space, the Muslim, Arab, South Asian space. I mean, when NSEERS happened, the National Security Registration Program in the Bush administration that required the registry of tens of thousands of Muslims, there was no response, no pushback. The Muslim community was devastated. And then in the last 6 weeks of the Obama administration, this enormously well-organized ecosystem of grassroots groups lobbied the Department of Homeland Security to dismantle the NSEERS architecture. So there's sort of like real mobilization now for this crisis moment that didn't exist before. And so while I think it's both more dangerous, I think we're also better positioned.
Okay, so you had asked about how do we work in coalition and collaboration while challenging these overarching problems. The overarching problem, I think, is an attack on constitutional law and also an attack of what our norms and values are and questioning of what those are. One thing I want to stress, like I come from Missouri, the border state he just mentioned. We used to be a purple state, purple like a bruise. Now we are blazing red. But we are not that simple. I live about 4 miles from Ferguson, where major civil rights initiatives were launched. And I also come from a state where my governor won after firing an AK into an empty field and trying to issue ISIS hunting licenses. So, Missouri is full of a variety of folks. But my point here is that every region is different, every city is different, and every place has a different framework and needs and values. And so you shouldn't expect people to protest the same way or to support the same causes. I think that's actually detrimental. I think people have things that are of particular interest to them, causes that they believe in, specialties, knowledge and skills that they can share. And the diversity of that, when combined against this administration, I think is what's most effective. The other thing I would say is that it's better to focus on laws, an attack on law, than try to change people's hearts and minds and attitudes. We talk a lot about upcoming elections and candidates and stuff. And again, I will stress Jeff Sessions till the day I die. We have to look at what laws and rights will be taken away. We have to look at concrete things and sort of trying to shift the political culture. That's possible, but it's not as important. It doesn't matter who the candidate is if people can't get out to vote. And finally, as someone who hails from, not quite Trump country, but from a state that went overwhelmingly for Trump, There are a few issues that I do think everyone kind of agrees on, and you see this in protests around the world, like in Russia, in South Korea. People will protest corruption. You know, there are certain attitudes that, that are horrific, like racism, that people are happy to publicly embrace. They feel no shame in that. There are very few people that are going to defend corruption. They're going to be like, no, don't do that. Like, I'm pro-corruption, I'm pro-kleptocracy, I'm pro-nepotism. I think it's awesome, although actually I think the latter was written about in Politico. But anyway, most people are anti those things, and they're a unifying point, I think, between a variety of people that otherwise don't agree on much. And so I think if we look at Trump as a corrupt administration, as a con artist, which he is, as a guy doing a shakedown, that's a narrative, that's a truth that a lot of different people can agree on. And so, I think that's a basis to start. It's proven effective in other countries as well.
I'm going to jump in, actually, before, and maybe push back a little on one of the points you made. You said that we have to focus on laws rather than the hearts and minds. And I guess I'll push back from a personal level, but I'm curious to hear other thoughts. It's just, I feel like one of the main critiques that I have of the Human Rights Act movement during the Bush era was its focus on law. And in fact, maybe a critique of the U.S. human rights lawyer-driven movement in general, that it was so focused on laws, on top-down change, that in pushing back against Bush on the norms and pushing and really holding on to constitutionalism and rallying around these values, we lost a lot of opportunity to actually shift the way that people's attitudes. And when Obama came around and many of those policies continued, it became harder for us. And then that maybe historically this is what's led us to this particular moment. So I guess just push back, maybe ask for the other panelists to weigh in and whether you think it's that simple, or Sarah, if you want to jump into, of course.
I mean, I was thinking more that there's this kind of concerted, we've got to flip the Trump voters. And I know people who voted for Trump, and they did so for a variety of reasons. For some, his racism and xenophobia was the primary appeal. For others, it was something they overlooked. I just think it's harder to do that. I think that kind of changing hearts and minds things works on a local level when you're surrounded by somebody who understands your own living situation, not somebody from the coast talking to somebody in a place like where I live. That's more what I was getting at. And also, the reason I'm concerned with laws is because I think that they are going to probably be repealed, things we took for granted through probably an executive order or an emergency situation. And that's why I see the urgency. But I see your broader points about what happened in the Bush administration continuing through Obama. Like, that's not something I disagree with at all. I think, honestly, we kind of need a full-on assault, but I worry about the laws more.
Do either of you have thoughts on how human rights defenders, human rights lawyers, especially, can be working on both of those fronts and in coalition with other groups?
No, I think that certainly there are, the institutional framework, particularly in the US, is very robust. And in fact, the biggest challenge to the administration's newest policies have been in the court as much as they have been from the streets. So yes, we need to secure these spaces, the institutional spaces, and work on the law. There's no disputing that. My only worry is that in a country like India, where say 50% of the population is less than 25, in that demographic, to catch people's attention and to hold it for anything more than 10 seconds is incredibly hard. And therefore, for me, the messaging is equally important. It's not just what you're doing on the law, but how are you putting your point of view across. And we are in the danger of losing a generation because we don't have the idiom of communicating with that generation. We have an idiom where we are much better at communicating with each other and talking at them rather than trying to convince them or using the tools, techniques, and methods that they use to communicate. So I think even if you did work on the law, how do you take this message across to the young and get them to be because that's, in India, as I said yesterday again, was that the most effective counter to the administration has not come from people like me. It has come from the university students, as it should be. And there's very little that people like me have done to support that, to make it more sustainable, to build it university by university and so on, because we just don't have the idiom to engage with them.
Thanks, Deborah. There's no one linear way to change. There's no universal prescription about how we secure positive developments in law or practice. But I think if you look at the United States, on January 27th, Trump issued a decree, as we're all well aware, banning refugees and travelers from 7 countries. January 28th, thousands of people across the country mobilized to airports. 1 day later, thousands of people in hundreds of airports across the world. January 29th, the federal court struck down that law. And I think that's what we've been saying all week. What we need to do is build solidarity among these different sectors. There's no one direct path to change. It involves the mobilization of several constituencies. And I want to go back very briefly to the question about incrementalism. I'm a bit biased. My screensaver is a picture of Malcolm X. It says, for freedom can't wait. And I think we need to make a distinction between the exercise of your right to dissent and what your goals are. Incrementalism in securing a policy change is one thing, but every human being, every person in the world is endowed the inalienable rights to speak out against their government. That's not incremental. If that strategy fails, if you don't secure your change, that's a reflection of many things. Maybe the clampdown or your tactics. But there's no incrementalism about your right to speak out and criticize the government.
Okay. I'm going to ask maybe one more question, and then in the spirit of what Biraj said, that the wisdom is with the students, with the crowd, turn it up and maybe open some questions and have everybody join in, both to ask questions but also to answer them. And that's to go back to the issue of judiciary. It's come up at different points in talking, and people have talked with some confidence. And Tor, you mentioned, the fact that the law, the executive order, was struck down. Again, maybe to play devil's advocate, or coming from a place of, having cut my teeth in the Bush era, I'm not necessarily all that confident in the U.S. judiciary's, robustness, or even though it is in many ways independent compared to some of the spaces that we're talking about, I don't necessarily have a lot of faith that they're going to step in, although I hope that this is different. I guess I want to ask you, to what extent do you feel like, are you relying, it's healthy to rely on the courts, or that maybe we might be in a different moment, and then also to hear from people, and this one I'll, after each of you or whoever wants to weigh in, open it up. If any of you have your own thoughts as to examples from other jurisdictions that have similarly placed judiciaries on what you think is happening now.
I think the Tor's point that I think courts are a necessary but utterly insufficient institutional tool to secure protections for vulnerable communities. They are, necessary in a way that if you can convince a court, they can order a government entity to stop doing something, and so far he has agreed to comply. So have that, important coercive and real power, but they're not sufficient because they get some of the political legitimacy to issue those orders from the public sphere, and that's why the marches were so critical and emboldened the courts. And I think any legal strategy has to be married with any sort of affirmative legal strategy to attack national polities has to be married with, organizing and activism and giving political space for the courts to make these decisions. At the same time, I think we need to also think about how to use courts to build space for activists to do their work. And so that means using legal resources towards criminal defense work, protecting dissent, protecting activists. So courts as a way to sort of challenge executive practices that are supported by mass mobilization that emboldens courts, but also legal strategies that protect activists and organizers so that they can continue to do the mobilization and challenging power that happens in this country really in a more durable way than any judicial change can.
I'll just comment briefly because I'm not somebody with a legal background. I feel like what's happening in the U.S. is that people are realizing their rights as they lose them, rights that they long took for granted before. And so, I think that will continue to happen, and it spurs the protests, which have had some effectiveness, but it's also something that can be deeply disheartening and disillusioning. One thing I'll just say, as someone who has studied authoritarian states, it's that it's extremely typical that once an autocrat gets into power, he will remove the judicial oversight that can keep him from carrying out either kleptocratic initiatives or just straight out crimes. And we should remember that Trump and other people associated with Trump are under FBI investigation for collusion with Russia. And this is going to cause him, I think, to make a lot of harsh and aggressive moves, including towards those who are engaged in investigating this issue, people like Comey, who he has recently threatened to fire. And so, I think that as activists or just people concerned about this, watching, making sure the people who are actually providing oversight over the situation, not Devin Nunes, the other people, are able to remain in their position of power is essential.
Thank you. I would agree completely with my co-panelists that there needs to be a marrying of civil society activism and strategic litigation. You can't have one without the other. There's an interesting example in Zambia that is of relevance, where it exemplifies this kind of amalgamation of legal strategy and advocacy, where in 2009 they passed an NGO law, which was quite restrictive, limited the work of every NGO in the country. And the NGOs, quite astonishingly, an interesting example of agency of NGOs, refused to register under this NGO law. They just refused. Said, the law is incompatible with our Constitution, we're not going to register. And that will have severe challenges for us as institutions. It'll prevent us from receiving foreign support and aid, which they were quite reliant on. And at the same time, they lodged a petition in the Constitutional Court challenging the law. And the government was so reliant on civil society and aware of the reliance on the NGO sector that they came to a settlement in the Constitutional Court and repealed the law. So it was a combination of both. Civil society activists sacrificed themselves at a public campaign and married that with a constitutional appeal, which resulted in a positive outcome. So I think where viable, it's an important step, but I think we have to also recognize what Sarah said, that in Uzbekistan, you cannot use the courts. In Ethiopia, you cannot use the courts. And in America right now, you can and should. And I hope it stays that way.
No, I agree with Bahir completely that, as somebody who's used strategic litigation for well over 15 years in the right to food case in India, that courts are not independent of the psychological and social forces that are in operation. And the most effective use of the court would be to combine it with public activism, because courts are also vulnerable in terms of their composition, in terms of who are the judges who are getting appointed, and in terms of the enormous pressure that in many of our contexts the judiciary is being put through. So unless it's combined with very active political public mobilization, courts independently will not be able to deliver.
Thank you. I think I'm going to open it up now and invite any questions from the audience, and also answers or comments on the conversation. Some of the issues that have come up that we haven't addressed so much here is just examples from your work and how we can ensure security of human rights defenders and the communities with whom we work. The issue of countering faux economic populism came up in the panel, and we haven't talked that much, so if you have thoughts on that. And then also the idea of coalition building and the strange bedfellows that we might find ourselves with, and thoughts on how you've negotiated thorny alliances and any lessons you have for us.
Hi, Sarah McCune. I wanted to raise one concern in particular that I have with the Trump administration's impact on the international human rights system. We've obviously seen some worrying signs so far, but at this past session of the Human Rights Council, China, on behalf of over 30 countries, actually issued a call for reform of human rights governance, which is quite concerning because this sounds like, an outright attack on the international human rights system on which so many human rights defenders depend. The mechanisms like UN special rapporteurs and various periodic reviews of states. And obviously their intention is to pursue a more sovereigntist agenda that prioritizes the state as opposed to individuals. But given that in the US, the executive has almost complete authority over what the state does at the international level, what strategies can we be using now to prevent significant damage being done by the time this 4-year administration is over?
Yeah, I want to sort of focus on something that I think several of the panelists alluded to. There actually was a period in the United States from about 1973 to 1980 when there was a very significant control of the national security establishment, specifically by the Congress. That was where the House and Senate Intelligence Committees come from. That was when the Congress actually legally tried to restrict the president's war-making power. And then from 1981 on, that was rolled back. It was rolled back systematically. It was rolled back at least as much under the Clinton and Obama administrations as under the Reagan and Bush administration. But it did happen. And my question is, what can we learn from that experience, which I think is in large part forgotten in the current mobilizations? And on the other hand, what should we not learn in view of the way that ultimately all of that more or less failed?
Oh, so this goes to not just the US context, but authoritarian regimes in general. Because again, those of you who've been paying attention lately, so that Syria bombing, Afghanistan bombing, much of that in the end wasn't to distract from much bigger issues at base. So how would you suggest just keeping both ourselves and then any of our constituencies focused on really the bigger issues, and given the tendency of those authoritarian bent to use distractions in order to lead people astray? So how do they stay focused on the main issue?
Especially distractions that cause so much harm. Maybe we'll take, you do one more? Okay. Next round, okay. So we have a question on China and the use of just how do we combat the rise of, states trying to dismantle the human rights institutions. There's a question on what can we learn from the period in U.S.'s own history when there was some pushback in the post-Nixon era, and then how do we deal with distractions of mass destruction? You can start with someone else this time.
Yeah, of course.
I'll take the third one, the
Okay.
distraction one. I think, yeah. I don't think that everything that Trump does is a distraction. I think the distraction element, one is reliant upon the media actually falling for it and doing it, but it's also sometimes a perk. I think that in terms of the military incursions that he's been doing lately, that's in part because he just wants to do that. He wants to flex that muscle. He's been wanting to play with weapons for a while, and he doesn't have an actual military strategy behind them. In terms of how to keep people focused on bigger issues, kind of to go back to what I said, I think everything is a big issue. I think the loss of health care is a big issue, loss of public education, the loss of civil rights, voting rights, and the Russia interference scandal, or, what it is, the investigation, is also a big issue. I focus a lot on Russia because I have this background in studying the former Soviet Union, and so I know the players, I know the oligarchs, I know how they operate. If I didn't have that background, my mind would be completely blown, and it's very hard, I think, for people who don't know this, to understand it, and I think it's hard for many Americans to have to deal with this question of, to whom is my president most loyal? Is it the United States? For all of the different corruption scandals we've had in the past, that's a new question, and it's kind of a mind-blowing one. I think that, what's important is that that gets carried out. That does rely somewhat on the media investigating, because they've often been able to relay information through leaks from intel agencies. But, honestly, we got to keep our eyes open on everything. Look at the way they're connected. A lot of this has to do with money, has to do with kleptocratic initiatives, has to do with Trump's willingness to abuse power, his narcissism. So, just keep your eye on the ball, and the ball's really big. So.
Thanks, Deborah. I'm just going to quickly respond to the first question about America's retreat from international bodies. I I worked at the UN in New York and worked at the UN in Geneva for years, and it is it is an existential issue. We're not trying to deal with it. In 1 week, 2 weeks ago, in 1 week, the United States refused to attend its Inter-American Commission on Human Rights briefing on the human rights situation in the United States. It boycotted the Israel debate at the UN Human Rights Council and removed itself from something called the EITI, which is the Extractive Industries Global Monitoring Body, in 1 week. There was not a lot of concern among domestic civil society or international media. And I think that's in large part a reflection of the fact that U.S. civil society has not actively engaged, historically, with international human rights mechanisms. To make sure that the Trump administration maintains its presence within these institutions, we need to make sure that they have value for our constituents in America. Matthew Jacob was up here yesterday from India, and we worked with him very closely on raising India at the Human Rights Council. Domestic NGOs are extremely skilled and well-versed in India and engaged with international human rights mechanisms. Special reporters, special procedures. There's a strong awareness and conversations with these mechanisms. That's lacking in America. And for us to make the case that we need to stay in these bodies, we need to actively engage in them, I think, as much as possible.
I'll pass, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to try to answer the first question. I don't have a great answer, and I think one of the other concerns I have about the kind of relevance or force of international norms is the kind of weakening of the UN system and what's happening not just in the United States, but in other places as well, like the UK, France, Amsterdam, Germany, Egypt, India, Israel, and is there, is this a sort of greater sovereigntist tide in international institutions? And I worry because I think, and there's not much leadership here. I mean, I think I'm optimistic about the vocabulary and the international human rights norms being useful in domestic activism, politics, like a right to water in Flint and other places, a right to health care, the sort of that vocabulary in our domestic political spaces. But you're right, the sort of the engagement with treaty bodies and institutions is at such a rarefied level in a way that I don't think people feel and are therefore motivated to hold leadership accountable for. So I don't really have a great answer to that, except that potentially it links into the second question about the possibility of fundamental transformation in some time. I mean, I think we've sort of been basically, around a sort of center-right, center-left consensus and acquiescence around executive power for since 1980, and maybe the level of disgust and danger around Trump will convince people that it doesn't matter just that you might have someone nice like Obama in power, that real institutions have to fundamentally change, and hopefully people are so disgusted, if we're all still alive, that there can be a massive sea change in representative politics.
I just want to really quickly change the dynamic briefly. If any of you have, not dynamic in terms of pessimism, but just flip, do any of you have questions for the audience that you want answered, like ideas for concrete examples, strategies that you didn't hear at the conference the last couple of days that you want to directly pose briefly? And we also welcome more questions, but I think it would be good. But anybody want to jump in? All right, jump in later. Okay.
Thank you very much for this really interesting panel. I think it's really great that you guys are having this discussion so early in the new administration. But I'm thinking that perhaps one can also use this opportunity, the Trump administration, to also build civil society, where one can come up with new mechanisms and tools of how to engage with government who's not on the same, who's not in the same length as what you are, but to find that common ground. And perhaps that in the past 8 years, civil society has become too comfortable and lost the creativity of engagement. So I'm just wondering, maybe this is an opportunity to make civil society stronger and come up with new opportunities for engagement, but also this idea of intersectionality within civil society, where you can engage and I think that came out very strongly with the travel ban, where civil society, even though they work on LGBT, but they also came out strongly for an organization who works on migration, for instance. So I think those idea of intersectionality within civil society and how can we collaborate and who's your allies and finding that allies and use that to build civil society. Just a comment, but I would just like to know what you have to say.
I'm from Hong Kong, so I know a thing or two about living under a government with authoritarian tendencies that is under the sway of a regime that is hostile to our fundamental values. So that's the starting point of my question. And what I really wanted to hear the panel's thoughts on is sustaining momentum. Because in the autumn of 2014, when the umbrella movement started, there was this enormous sense, in spite of the challenges the movement faced, of optimism, of a sense that there was hope that people were fundamentally decent. And fast forward now 2.5 years, almost all of that is gone. There is a prevailing sense of despair, of rage. We see localist protests that are fundamentally not just anti-mainland, but in some cases anti-mainlander. There is unprecedented fragmentation in the pro-democracy movement, if one can indeed call it a movement at all. So my question is essentially, it's all very well looking at the first few weeks or even the first few months, but this is a years-long campaign, if we're going to live that long. How do we keep up the momentum?
So mine is just a comment to the panelists, and maybe just something that you could think about moving forward. For me, the Trump administration, I look at it positively because it's a rude awakening for the civil society in America to look inward. You've tended to look outward most of the time. We look at you as experts, as the people we come to when our government is cracking down on us. So those strategies you usually give us, now use them here. I think it's also, about time. And also this issue of running to court, all issues. The phrase in the state is, I'll sue you for everything. So how about you build social, your own social movements, build coalitions to be able to work together. I don't know whether that works here, but I know through, for example, the Civil Society Reference Group, it has been an umbrella body when the government is coming after Kenyan NGOs. So why don't you have that here, as opposed to running to court when something small happens? It could lead to sort of like judicialization of conflicts that you might not end up sustaining for too long. So it's something you could think about. It might not work here, but you could think about it.
We'll take one more, and then we'll take just for this round.
So, very much appreciate the panel, and I take this as sort of a global perspective on the United States. So I'd say, what would we say about a country where all the political power is controlled by a party elected by a minority of the voters, where the Congress, the House, is so gerrymandered, more Americans voted for Democrats than for Republicans, but the Republicans control the House. Our Senate, with 2 senators for each state, I looked it up recently, the borough where I live, Brooklyn, has a bigger population than about 15 states. So there are 30 senators represented by those 15 states with smaller populations than my borough, which participates in the election, I guess, of about 1/8 of a senator. And then, of course, we have the Electoral College. So if we were looking at another country, I think we would be quite critical of the political institutions, and yet we don't really talk much about the United States. We still accept what we tell ourselves about being a great democracy. So my question is whether or not political reform should be part of the resistance agenda. I'm not saying that the party in power wasn't elected according to the rules that exist, but the rules that exist allowed a minority of voters, even with our low turnout, to control all the levers of government and to attempt to pass a very radical agenda that the majority of Americans don't support.
Okay, thank you. So we have 4 comments and questions, one on political reform as part of the resistance agenda, one on why don't we use our own strategies that we've been exporting here. I would actually say maybe we just need to bring people, bring you to come and train us rather than use our own export. One about sustaining momentum and really how do we both keep the optimism and the cynicism and the realism all in one space. How do we hold both? And then what do we think about this as an opportunity to build civil society? Raj, you want to start?
Sure. So I'll just take a couple of those. I think the fundamental issue for me is that what is the ideological counter to this politics of demonization? And the reality is that there isn't an ideological counter which is coherent, which is clear, which is appealing to the people enough to stand up. And this is a big problem in India. We don't have a left anymore, a party political left, which is powerful enough to counter this ideology. And therefore, there is a space that civil society can fill in. I agree, this is a defining moment for civil society, not just in the US, but across the world, because when the lines are so sharply drawn, it's better to be in this position where you are very clear on what the opposition is and the way ahead, than there being any fuzziness on ideological grounds. But in the absence of a more coherent political alternative, which we have not been able to present, at least not in India, in the US maybe yes, but I don't know how long we'll be able to sustain momentum without that.
I'll take the hope one. I think that concept of hope and change is linked to this American optimism that has proven so detrimental throughout this entire political cycle, because I think a lot of people thought that, one, the impossible couldn't happen, and 2, that, the grown-ups would eventually come in and fix things, that this couldn't really degrade and fall apart in this way. And so, I'm not a big fan of hope. I'm also not a big fan of hopelessness. I think the two concepts just aren't relevant to what's at play. I'm a fan of pragmatism and of strategy, and I think that takes, it's necessary to have a realistic assessment of the situation. And I think realistically, we are in a very bad situation. That doesn't mean that we're powerless over that situation. There's still, many, many ways to act, which have been laid out, through this. And so, I would encourage people to just look hard at what has happened. Don't shy away from it, don't gloss it over, and don't wait for somebody else to fix it and just think that it's going to work out. It could work out, but it'll work out if enough people push it and work it, and that's what's necessary to happen.
Oh, I'm having an existential crisis. I have a year to live, so I just wasn't aware. So maybe Bahir, you go first. I just wasn't aware.
I might have a little bit more. I suppose I don't have all that much to add. I mean, in terms of the political mobilization, it creates a feeling of hopelessness that the system is fundamentally rigged, and the system has been sort of baked in for a long time. The Electoral College, part of the original sin of slavery in this country. I suppose, it's hard to imagine a kind of revolution that would transform the rules of the Senate or the Electoral College, although maybe it's possible. But there are ways in which even within that system, as you've identified, the rules are dangerous around gerrymandering, and the ways in which in the Sessions Justice Department they could get much worse, because I think what the right sees is one, a demographic reality that is so threatening that they need to change the rules around voter suppression and gerrymandering and everything to control power, because it's about managing power. And so that's where it's essential to resist, at least on the margins in the next few terms. Otherwise, we'll never be able to flip it. And I mean, the question about building civil society is a great one, or maybe are there new ways to do it? I mean, I'm only aware of one way, and maybe there are others, which is just to use power through electoral politics and the judiciary, and they have it and we don't, and so they win and we lose, our communities lose. But one thing that seems important to me is, the left seems romantically fixated on just one office, the presidency, the sort of romance of, FDR and Lincoln and Kennedy and Obama, and while the right has been organizing in local elections for 40 years and controlling that power, and hopefully, this is to Sarah's point about everyone getting organized and everyone being activated, can start doing that on a local level, and that's a long-term project, but seems critical.
I just wanted to add one point. Tashwell and Pauline, you made I think you hit the nail on the head. I have two schools of thought about civil society and where they stand now. I think one is that we were so successful that there is this backlash now. That the 2011 people's movements across the Middle East and across the world were so successful in engendering systemic change that the governments have now used more insidious and also more brutal tactics to suppress civil society. So the crackdown is a reflection of our power and our success as activists. The second school of thought is that we have become too complacent and rested on our laurels as activists. Right? We have not developed more innovative strategies within the current climate of technology and otherwise. And I think it's a reflection of both, and one can learn from the other. And I think Tashwell and Pauline, we do have a tremendous amount to learn from you, is most importantly. In terms of mobilization, in terms of using international mechanisms, everything discussed today, we have a lot to learn from our comrades across the world, and it's been reiterated and reiterated, but I think it's a crucial point.
I wonder whether the question isn't that both schools of thought can coexist, and that some groups were pushing back in creative ways and suffering the backlash, while other groups were perhaps growing more complacent. And what this crackdown does is push the groups that were more complacent into the space where the groups that were previously marginalized were pushing. We are at time, but we'll have requests for one or two more questions. Bear with us, thank you. Or comments.
For me, personally, more horrifying than the knowledge that Donald Trump became the president of the United States was the realization that he was elected by not, as in the case of the election of Hong Kong chief executive, 1,200 members of the election committee, but by such a large portion of our electorate, even if it's not a majority. So these voters voted for him, knowing that he is a liar, he's a con man, but they were willing to overlook those facts and now have put him in place to build a kleptocracy. These are fellow citizens. They're not other people. They're part of the polity. So how does one, I don't know how to deal with that. How do we go forward? How do we, I mean, they have probably as much, if not more, opportunities for education, for becoming knowledgeable, smart, than I am a naturalized citizen. However, their values are unfathomable to me. How do we as individuals deal with that?
Thanks. My name is Emerson Sykes. I work with ICNL. Thanks so much to this panel. One of the things that the main part of my job is working with folks like Pauline and others to provide advice, an American providing advice in sub-Saharan Africa. So I thought I might just share a couple of quick things that I can bring back as well. Having been pointed out the complicated role that I play in the new reality. But I think one of the things that we talked about is coalition building. And I think what I've seen work and not work is that you have to be realistic about what these coalitions might look like. Oftentimes we'll go and we'll meet with civil society leaders in different countries and they'll say there's not enough solidarity among civil society. We need more solidarity among the sector. And I always sort of say, well, it's good that the sector is diverse. The whole point of civil society is that it represents a variety of interests. We shouldn't actually expect all NGOs in the country to be on the same page about almost anything. That's kind of the point of the democracy. So it's not that we all have to be on the same page, but what I think really works well, and I think Suba Churchill is the chair of the CSO reference group, I think this is probably the prime example of this, is when you have a broad-based but very focused issue-based coalition. So you define your one thing, but maybe you define it broadly. So not everybody can do everything, but the coalition's around a specific issue. And I think it's important, given that there are so many issues out there, I think we are all sort of experiencing, every morning you look at your phone and it's like, how do I even decide what I'm most outraged about? But I think, it's hard to pick one thing, but I think many media outlets have started ignoring tweets, which I think is probably healthy for all of us, but focusing on issues where there has been actual harm, and there are plenty, where people have actually already started to feel the effects. Laws have already been broken. There are threats, there are vibes, there are all sorts of things that are worrying, but there are also certain things that have been done that have created harm. I think, Tor, you brought up the example of folks running to the airports. That was a concrete issue that we saw mobilization around. And obviously, I'm for fighting white supremacy. I think marching against white supremacy is hard. I think marching against stop and frisk, litigating against stop and frisk is much easier. So I don't know how helpful that is, but that's just a bit of reflection from going both ways.
Thank you. So we have a request for a few more questions. We understand if some people may need to leave, we understand, please feel free to quietly do that, but we're going to continue since there's some interest in more discussion.
Thanks. I want to do a quick comment and then a question. I want to build on the coalition building discussion, and I think we do have a great deal to learn from civil society and very difficult, other situations like China where we work. But I also think that what I've been thinking about listening to this conversation is we can learn a lot from looking at the history of this country. And it was referred briefly, but I'm thinking specifically about Paul Robeson and Bill Patterson. And I'm thinking about the Negro Civil Rights Congress, which was pre-60s, pre-50s, in the height of the McCarthy era. And they built cross-race, including Chinese immigrant workers. It was cross-race, it was cross-economic class. It included a strategy that included cultural strategies, gatherings with faith communities, performances, a calendar, and they were the first to try to petition for a genocide petition of, at the time they said the Negro people, that included corporate genocide of companies like Dow Chemical, evidence-based, case-based, thousands of cases that were documented, and they brought it to the baby Geneva in headquarters then in Paris. They also had a separate box going to another city because they thought that would mysteriously get lost en route to Geneva, which it did. But they had the backup box. So I think that there's a lot that got lost that when they were dismantled piece by piece, painfully, by the IRS, attacking who were members, who paid, who were memberships, and they just took down every single state. So I think we should look back, because it was very inspiring to see the cross-racial, cross-economic, and the strategies were amazing. And it was geographic. The buses that went down to the places under attack with the lynchings and the mass, those were all cross-racial. So I want us to recover that back, because, and I think that's what happened. They were successful, is why they were taken down. So the question is that we're hearing a lot from some of our Chinese activist friends, and also not friends, like party official outlets, saying, this is an example of why democracy does not work. We're like Exhibit A. Chaos, bad things happen, worse bad things. So I think for like Biraj and Emerson and those wonderful folks from yesterday who gave such great counter narratives, I'd love to hear a counter narrative to help us think about democracy will work. I mean, I hope we're saying that. Are we?
Yeah.
It would seem
Okay,
that.
here's a comment. I have a comment to make.
Just 1 minute. Go ahead.
This morning, I believe one of the panelists mentioned about the Chinese people who look at the echelon or the leaders on the top who send their children or themselves, their wives or their mistress to the West while criticizing their values. And they kind of laugh at that because they realize if it's so bad, why are you sending your loved one there to study or be part of it? So it creates indifference. And I think any part of any system that creates that kind of indifference, and the result will not be that good.
It would seem that we're in a era of unprecedented information. So I would think that our greatest enemy is propaganda. And when you go and you look at Twitter in the morning outside of Ms. Kenzior's feed, how do you separate the truth from the theory, from the wishful thinking, from the propaganda?
Do we have time for a few minutes of response? Or, yeah. Okay.
I'd like to respond on the question of the Trump voters because I covered the campaign and I interviewed a lot of Trump voters, and I did in different contexts. I went to rallies, and I also just went to places near me in Missouri and in southern Illinois where most people are voting Trump. Most of the country didn't vote for Trump. That's the first thing. Half the country didn't vote. I think that's very important to remember as we're attempting to build these coalitions and build civil society, is that half the country was so just tapped out and fed up that they didn't show up. And, finding out what those people think and what they want, how they can be involved is important. Of the group that voted for Trump, the way that this election was covered was mostly coastal media flying into places like where I live, finding the absolute craziest person that they could, putting them on TV all the time, screaming, build the wall, and then presenting that as like kind of the archetype of the Trump voter. And of course, if you're dedicated enough to go around to rallies, then yeah, you're a Trump voter. And a lot of those people were attracted to Trump for his worst qualities. They liked the racism, they liked the xenophobia, they liked the hate. And I think in this situation, it's kind of hate versus hope. You said they voted for a liar and a con man and they knew. From interviewing Trump voters, they really didn't, especially when I would go to small towns in Missouri and in southern Illinois. These Trump voters weren't all that enthusiastic. They were kind of like, we've got two losers. We've got Trump and we've got Hillary, and we have had 8 years of economic misery. That would be something where the hope came in, the sort of blind faith in Trump. When he would say something like, the economic statistics are wrong, we've got 40% unemployment, and I think a lot of people in the country laughed at that. As a Missourian, like that hit me in the heart. And I hate this guy, and I can't stand him, but I felt that because that is exactly how it feels there. It feels like unemployment is 40%. So he was able to do that, and that's part of it. I think there's also a lot of Trump voters who just voted for, it didn't have to do with him. They were pro-life, and that's it. Whoever the pro-life guy is who they get on board with. They were Republican, that's it. They vote for whoever the Republican is. I wonder what they're thinking. The Trump voters that I've talked to in Missouri since the election are mad. One of the most interesting conversations I had was with a guy who absolutely hated the Ferguson protests. He just thought they were wrong. He was very pro-police. And he said, I can't stand these protests against Trump. Trump needs to change so that the protests will stop. And I was absolutely startled because it's just the inverse of every narrative of protest I ever heard. And he just said, it's too chaotic. There's no stability. I voted for this guy because I thought he was strong and in control, and he can't keep anything in control. Look at the airports. And I thought, wow, this is actually working. I don't think this guy's going to go out in the street, and join everybody. But I think if Trump runs again, this is not someone who will be voting for him. And I think that you see this gradual chipping away at the, sort of people who voted for Trump without a lot of enthusiasm to begin with in red states. And that makes me a little hopeful. He'll always have a core base, though, and we just have to admit that they like this. They're extremists. And we've always had racism. This is not new. These people just got a lot of media attention. We've always had a very racist population, and we should not be building them up. We should know that they exist. We should stop giving puff pieces and profiles to neo-Nazis. That's a whole other subject. You brought up the propaganda issue. That's a bit of a problem. I'll tap on that.
Just a one-line response to Sharon. Sharon, the only answer to bad democracy is more democracy. And power to all of us to work that out now.
Any final thoughts, Tor?
Just Emerson's right, as always. Clear messaging and objectives are essential, but not the only thing. I think you also said that as well, Emerson, where the Occupy movement was a good example of that. Very clear messaging, 99-1, inequality, very clear. But it was just a solely protest-driven movement. There was no coalition building, there was no direct outreach to politicians or allies in the government. I think both, you can have a really clear two-number messaging that everyone understands, but if you don't also build coalitions, as you said, it's really hard to get momentum and sustain the movement. Thanks.
Yeah, I just echo the point about democracy being a solution, but embedded in democracy, fixing democracy is making sure that the democratic rules are not stacked against us, and that requires a very serious response in the next 2 to 4 years, given the desire to stack the rules. And I think I just want to underscore, I agree that the point about coalition building is really important. I think I'm not an organizer, but I think a lot of the civil society space recognizes that. I mean, the story about one story I've heard about the women's march is that it was initially identified to focus around reproductive rights. They brought in more organizers, including organizers of color, who wanted to broaden the scope of the coalition and surface many other issues, and I think that's very much on the minds of organizers. And finally, I think it's right that one way we may be able to move some people who otherwise support some of Trump's policies in the abstract is to, someone said, focus on real harm to real people. And stories about the ways in which these policies are damaging real individuals. I mean, obviously storytelling is enormously important and itself a kind of ballast against authoritarianism.
On that note, I think we're going to wrap up. I just want to say thank you to our panel, but also thank you to all of the panelists over the last 2 days and to our organizers. Thank you to all of you who've been to these events. And I hope this is the beginning or the continuation of more collaboration among all of our groups. And Sukti, do you want to say what's happening next? Or?
For anyone that wants to stay around, we will be able to have this room for another hour or so. So there'll be coffee and cookies if you want to talk, continue the dialogue. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. I don't know why I'm not talking.
Hello. As I said, so we have this room for about another hour. Clearly, it's the end of the day. If you want to stick around and continue the conversation, you're more than welcome. But more than anything, thank you so much for being such a fantastic audience and being so engaged in the last few days. It's really been an honor to share this space with you. Thank you.
Thank you.